Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Pros podcast. I'm your host, Tally Shamus, and this is going to be the last episode of 2025. I want to take a moment to wish you all a happy new year and thank you for coming along on this journey with me. This podcast has already grown so much over the past 4 months, and I am so grateful to all of you who keep tuning in and listening to the episodes. I cannot wait for all that 2026 has in store for us, so remember to keep checking back. But for today, we'll be sitting down with Demi Michelle Schwartz to talk about short stories. Demi Michelle Schwartz is an author from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, represented by Ciara Smith at Spencerhill Associates. She primarily writes young adult fiction, focusing on the fantasy and thriller genres, though she loves to explore other genres and age categories in her short stories found in anthologies. In 2019, Demi graduated summa cum laude with BAs in creative writing and music from Seton Hill University, then earned her MFA in writing popular fiction at Seton Hill in June of 2022. Along with being an author, Demi is the host of Literary Blend, a publishing podcast, a freelance fiction editor through her independently run services, Amethyst Ink Editorial, an editor for Revise Resub, RevPit, and an award-winning songwriter and recording artist. So, Demi, why don't you tell me about your writing journey?
I have always loved writing ever since I was little. When I was a senior in high school, my creative writing teacher told me that he thought I should major in English in college. But I already decided to be a music major. But my freshman year of college, I took an honors English course, and my professor told me the same thing. She's like, "You should major in English." And I'm like, "This is the second person who told me this. I should probably look into it more." So I started taking some classes as a minor in creative writing. Loved it so much that I added a major. Basically, when I was a junior, I did a 4-year degree in 2 years, which was crazy. I took like over 20 credits a semester because that was insane. As soon as I finished undergrad, I went to my MFA in writing popular fiction program, graduated from that in 2022. Then, right after that, I started querying. The first time I queried, I did for about a year and 4 months, and then signed with an agent, and earlier this year, I decided to seek new representations. But aside from being an author and writing books, I also have an obsession with short stories, which is why we're here today. I'm also a freelance editor. I have my own publishing podcast, and I'm an editor for RepPit, which is really fun.
Wow, so it sounds like you've been keeping pretty busy.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So, given your background, your education, I think it would be great to dive into some craft questions. Um, so, you had mentioned short stories. So, what draws you to writing short stories?
So I think the main reason why I started writing short stories is because with my novels, I'm the biggest plotter ever. And so I will plot books for months to a year. And then when I sit down to draft them, I can draft them pretty quickly and I can revise pretty quickly too. But because I'm a plotter, I'm not always actively writing new things. I'm always planning the stories or revising stories, but I'm not always drafting and coming up with new material. And as a creative and as a songwriter too, I believe that it's so important to continue to work those creative muscles and stay inspired and stay creating, because if you take too long of a break, it can be hard to get back into it, or at least from my own experience, that's how it's for me.
Mhm.
And so I decided to write short stories because when I'm in between novel projects, when I'm plotting new books, or when I'm actively revising but not writing new material, short stories are a really great way for me to consistently create and come up with new ideas. And what I've noticed, and this is something I was recently talking to about with my best friend, I went back and read old short stories I wrote in college, and I was appalled of like how generic they were, how poorly they were written. But aside from that, I just noticed that from writing so many short stories, over a period of time, my ideas have become more original. I've been thinking more outside the box. And obviously, that translates well into novels as well, with how crowded the market is and having to stand out in the query trenches. And then when you're on submission, being the one to stand out in an editor's pile. And so I think writing short stories as well has really helped me to stay creative and consistently stretch my own boundaries in order to come up with new, fresh, and creative ideas.
And I mean, you're doing it all with very limited word counts. So, how do you deal with that? How do you build your characters? How do you handle pacing when your writing area is so condensed?
It definitely was a challenge at first because when I wrote my first couple of novels, I was an overwriter and I was the one cutting thousands of words out of a manuscript. But now after having written many short stories, I'm definitely more of an underwriter now where I have to go back and add more to a novel to get it into the expected word count range. And I think the reason why is when you're writing short stories, you need to be extremely aware of word choice and saying things in as few words possible while getting the idea across and the characterization across, which definitely is a challenge, especially because I specifically write for anthologies. So when I see a submission call, the word count range is given to me. It can be like between 3,000 or 5,000. And so I'm given those parameters before I even start writing. And so when I see the word count range and how long or short the story has to be to fit the submission call, my first thought is okay, I need to come up with an idea and characters on the scope that fits that prompt. When I started writing short stories, I found my ideas were too complicated that lended themselves more to novels, and I really struggled to make them fit for short stories. Specifically with characterization, we still need to feel connected to the character. We still need the interiority, and this characters still need to feel real and developed. But what I found is a really great way to have a compelling short story character in the few words you're given is to really focus on one thing about them that causes them to either change by the end of the story or have some kind of realization. It needs to be like something. It doesn't have to be extreme. It can be super subtle, but the reader should see some kind of shift in that character. It could be a flaw they have that they overcome by the end, or maybe at the climax of the story, they have to make a choice that really shows them something about themselves that they haven't noticed until that moment. And so, just as long as there's some kind of shift from who the character was at the beginning to the end, they'll have that arc on a much smaller scale than in a novel. When it comes to pacing, that's a tricky one because I think it's genre specific. Like for example, I write in my novels, I write fantasy and thriller, but in my short stories, I love to explore other genres and I write pretty much anything. And so I found that the pacing approach varies based on what I'm writing. So if I'm writing a very atmospheric horror, maybe the pacing's a little slower just to like really get into the atmosphere and the lingering suspense and the tension and holding the reader in that moment versus like a very high stakes adventurous fantasy. The pacing will be much quicker, and so it's always a challenge when I start, but this is where I feel like beta readers and critique partners really come in because they're the ones who point out, maybe you can linger in this moment a little longer. We want a little more here. Or maybe this section of the story feels a little slow and it's taking a little too long to get to this part. Maybe tighten this. And so feedback is super important as well to help with pacing.
Now, once you've got all of that down, what does your revision process look like, and how does that differ between short stories and your longer form writing?
So I don't think it differs that much, which is interesting because they're the ones are super short and the other one's super long. Obviously, the novels take way longer to revise, and when I revise my novels, I go chapter by chapter because that's how my brain works. I'm not the one to jump around. I literally go chapter by chapter. But in terms of the short stories, what I like to do is after I finish a draft, I do revisions on my own. I do a round of line edits to make it as clean as I possibly can. Then I have a couple friends read it, and that's the same with my novels. I never ever submit anything without getting feedback, and I think that's extremely important. I think we need outside perspectives in order to fully realize our visions for stories and make them be what they're meant to be. And so the same thing applies with my short stories, and especially when I'm working toward an anthology deadline, I definitely keep that in mind as well because I'm not the person to submit the day of the deadline. Say an anthology submission is due November 1st. I will make sure to have that drafted at least a couple weeks earlier. That way I can do some revisions on my own, send it to some friends, get the feedback, revise, and then let it sit for a day or two, and then go back and revise it one more time with fresh eyes. I think having space from a project is so important, and I do that with my novels as well, because if you have some separation from it and then go back and read it again with fresh eyes, then you can pick up on things that you didn't notice the first time or even the second time you revised it. So that's a little glimpse into how I revise my stories.
Okay. And so you mentioned sending it to your friends and having them take a look. Do you ever get feedback that you disagree with? And if so, how do you handle that?
Yeah, so I think sometimes, I don't know if it's necessarily that I disagree because I think that all feedback has a place. And the feedback that I find less or the least helpful is the kind that's extremely subjective to the point where maybe someone reading the story just isn't a fan of the trope I use. And so of course they're not going to enjoy the story as much as others because if they don't like that trope, they're gonna have their perspective of like, I don't know about this, I don't like that, and it becomes really subjective.
Mm,
And so that's not feedback I necessarily disagree with because that's their personal preference. But what I recognize is that wasn't the reader for the story, and that's totally okay. Like, there's nothing wrong with that.
mhm,
But I find as well with feedback is if somebody would suggest something that doesn't exactly align with my vision, I never discard it because what they're pointing out, and this goes for novels as well. If
mhm,
somebody points something out in your story and they're saying, "I think you should do this," or "This part isn't working for me, and maybe you can try that." And even if their suggested change doesn't resonate with your vision, they're still pointing out an area of the story that didn't work for them for some reason. And so, if I get a suggestion on one of the elements of the story and changing it would ruin my vision for the story, which I always keep in mind, I wanna make sure I tell the story I wanna tell, but their comment makes me realize, okay, there's something off about this character. It might not be what they specifically said, but it's making me realize something needs to change. And so I always really stress for everyone, like when you get feedback, really sit with it and
mhm,
read between the lines. Sometimes a piece of feedback isn't exactly the right fit for your story, but it will spark a new idea for
mhm.
something that's adjacent to their suggestion that really helps strengthen the story.
Right. That makes sense. And then I guess on a related note, how do you decide ultimately what to cut? And do you ever have trouble cutting things?
I do. I have trouble cutting things. I also have trouble adding things, which is why when I plot my books, I try as hard as possible to like get the first draft in the ballpark of the word count because I'm like, I don't want to like cut things to make the pacing too fast or add things just to add things and slow things down. So it's always a challenge. I think again, this is where like critique partners and beta readers come in because there might be a paragraph in the story that I feel is necessary, but from the reader perspective, I could get 3 friends saying the same thing, which is that paragraph doesn't really need to be there because we can infer what the character's thinking here on our own. And so little things like that and, just reading it, like, the separation from it really helps because there's so many times where I have, like, details and I'm reading it back and I'm like, "That isn't necessary," or I'm reading my story back and there's a part where I feel like the pacing here is too quick. Maybe I can slow down here just a little bit. And so it really comes down to the separation from the story and allowing yourself to see it as close as possible from the viewpoint of a reader to kind of shift your perspective. And if this was a story written by another author and I'm editing it for one of my Amethyst Ink authors, what would I tell them? And I try to put my editor hat on like that when I'm reviewing my own stories too.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Now, we know that you have a background in terms of your degrees in writing. W- How do you think that that formal education compares to people that are self-taught or to people that rely on their community, social media, craft books? And I guess related to that, are there any tools or craft books or courses that you would recommend to someone that maybe doesn't have an MFA?
Yeah, so my 3 favorite craft books, I hope I'm not gonna mess up the authors, but I got the titles right. So the one that I absolutely love that I really encourage authors to read, especially if they're struggling with voice and characterization, is Writing the Intimate Character by Jordan Rosenfeld. That one's a great one with point of view, voice, perspective, interiority, and characterization, which is great. Another one is GMC Goal Motivation Conflict by Deborah Dixon. This was the required reading I had to do when I first started my MFA program, and it is amazing because It ties into GMC, which is goal motivation conflict, which all characters need to have, even short story characters. But this also ties into agency. And so if you're ever getting feedback from agents or beta readers saying your characters are lacking agency, what that means is that their GMCs aren't clear enough. And because of that, it feels like the character is just moving through the story while the plot's happening to them, rather than the character taking the reins of the story and driving the plot toward their goal and being fueled by their motivation. And so that's a really great book to really dig deep into what goal, motivation, and conflict are and how you can strengthen those elements in your own writing.
Mhm.
And then the last one, which is one of my favorites as well, is A Writer's Guide to Active Setting by Mary Buckham. One of my MFA professors actually had me read this one semester because I was really struggling with setting descriptions, and I was going about it in not the best way. And this book completely changed my perspective on setting, because when you include sensory details and you're describing something in a story, it should all be filtered through your character's perspective.
Mm.
If you have two different characters who walk into a room, they're going to notice different things and feel different ways based on the setting, based on who they are as people, their backstories, their personalities. And so that book really helped me to understand how to craft setting descriptions and use sensory details that not only create an immersive setting and scene for the reader, but also give glimpses into characterization. We can learn a lot about a character based on how they see the world around them.
Wow.
So those are 3 books I really love. In terms of, like, the difference between having an MFA and, authors who don't, first of all, I just wanna stress here that you absolutely do not need an MFA to be an author. There are so many different paths you can take. That's just a choice I decided to the path I decided to go down. I would say that my MFA definitely helped so much in terms of the craft, and also in the business. However, you cannot learn all you need to learn by sitting in a classroom or having a conversation on Zoom, because the publishing industry changes so quickly and it moves so quickly. And there's so many moving parts that you absolutely cannot get by just reading a book or being in a class. And so I honestly thought, like, after I graduated, I was like, I'm so ready. I got this. I should not have queried my first book at all. It was not ready at all. But I don't see that as a failure, because, like, I needed to fully immerse myself into the queer trenches and the industry as a whole to get a grasp on it. And so even though I feel like my degree definitely gets me a foundation in understanding the craft, and also it's a foundation for me becoming an editor, in terms of navigating the publishing industry, I think that's something that, like, each of us has to do on our own. We can get the help from classes and books and an MFA, but the only way to truly understand how the industry works is to put yourself in it.
Right. That's very fair. And now, I guess on that note, I'd like to just take a little step back and um m- considering your journey, your querying journey and now being back in the querying trenches, what advice would you give to querying writers in terms of what to look for in an agent, what to watch out for, just general feedback or
Yeah, so I would just say to really be aware of what you want in an agent and the vision you have for your story and your career as a whole.
mm,
And I know I completely understand how getting that yes, it can make you go, "Oh my gosh, I got my yes." But really stop and reflect and ask yourself, like, is this the partnership I want? Is this the path I want to take? And also, and this was huge for me. So when I decided to seek new rep, I had, like, this major moment of reflection of being scared to, like, basically start all over. That's basically what I did. And it was hard for me to do that, but I really had this moment of reflection, like, the way my career is going right now, is this the future that I want for myself and my stories? And I had to be honest with myself and make hard choices, because, like, all of us work so hard on our stories. We bust our butts every day. And if you're not feeling like you're in a position where you're thriving and flourishing, or if you feel like something's holding you back and something just doesn't feel right, we have the choice to make changes and we have the ability to take a different direction, even if it's difficult. So I would just suggest for everyone to be aware of their feelings, their goals, their vision for their story, and make the hard choices if you have to. And so just think about the journey and do what's best for you.
I mean, everything's a learning experience. I'm sure that all that you've been through has taught you so much. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I think that's a great perspective to have. Yeah, so diving back into then the short stories, one of the big benefits is that you can get them published and then that can be a credential for you. But where do you find calls for submissions or even contests? Do contests help you? Can you touch a little bit on that?
So I haven't submitted to any contests. I've only done anthologies, and I recently submitted a story to an online literary magazine for the first time that got accepted. But my main focus is in anthologies because I just love the idea of holding a book with my work in it and being able to put that on the shelf and doing unboxing videos is just very fun for me. It's also really validating too, especially like I started really writing and submitting short stories when I was on submission
Mm.
before, and that was like really helpful for me because it gave me validation. Like every time I got an anthology acceptance, I was like, somebody loves my work and they want to publish it. I'm a good writer. I'm not bad. And so, yeah, I think they're really great to kind of give you those confidence boosts and give you validation that you're on the right path. It's also nice to have those publishing credits because that not only shows people in the industry that your work is being published elsewhere, but it's also showing your involvement in the publishing industry. It's showing that you are putting yourself out there
Hmm.
and taking steps forward on your own, not just sitting back and waiting for an agent to sign you. Like you're actually going out there and trying to make connections and get your work in front of readers because ultimately, like the readership I'm building through my short stories could very well want to read my books. And so it's all about building that audience on a smaller scale before the book comes out. In terms of finding them, so I find a lot on Twitter.
Mm.
I, like, basically train my algorithm to show me submissions that I shouldn't have done because I don't have the time to, like, do 50,000, which I still do. But a way you can find them is, like, literally in the Twitter search bar, type anthology submissions or, like, anthology submit or, like, variations of that, and you can literally sort it, like, for latest and see, like, all the tweets going out from publishers and editors who are announcing submission calls, so I find out that way. Also,
Cool.
now that I'm doing it for a while, now that I've been doing it for a while, there are certain publishers that I know who consistently do them.
Mm.
And so I have a list of those, so I consistently check their websites, and I'm also subscribed to, like, some of their newsletters too, so, like, when they have anthology sub calls, like, I get the notifications. And so those are some ways I get them. Also, several of my friends also submit to anthologies. I'm proud of myself because I got them all obsessed with them too. And so they'll be like, "Hey, Jimmy, like, did you see this one?" I'm like, "No, I didn't." And then so we kind of exchange sub calls too. So if you have any writer friends who you know writes for anthologies, definitely ask them like, "Hey, I want to write a horror short story. Do you know of any horror anthologies coming up?" Or I love romance. Do you have any romance suggestions for anthologies? So your network and the writing community is also great. I've seen people literally just tweet, "Hey guys, any submission calls?" And believe me, I'm in your replies, letting you know what's open.
That's amazing. So then, do you tailor your stories to those specific calls for submissions, or do you have short stories and then you look for places to submit them?
So I write specifically for calls. The only time where I'll submit something for a call that I didn't actually write it for is if that story was previously passed on and I'm still trying to place it. And so I find it easier to write for a prompt because I'm tailoring it exactly to what the editors of the anthology are looking for versus having a short story and just seeing, okay, it kind of fits, but like it's not the perfect fit because it wasn't written for that. In those instances, I have made some subtle tweaks to kind of tailor it a little better or like revise it and clean it up a bit before resubmitting. But I have had there's one short story I absolutely love that's a young adult quiet horror that I wrote for an anthology. It got rejected and I was so sad, but I submitted it to another one and it got accepted. And so definitely keep submitting them if you find another submission call that they fit. The other thing with anthologies that can be challenging though is that some of them have extremely specific like prompts. And in those instances, it can be hard to find somewhere else to place it. Like I have a couple lying around that I haven't placed again yet, just because they were so specific for the anthology and I haven't come across something yet. But you never know, I might down the road.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But the other thing I would say too is I've been the editor for two anthologies through Outing Publishing. The one is Prom Perfect that came out in April. And right now, I'm editing for a butterfly anthology called Kaleidoscopic Quill that I actually am the anthologist for as well. And from being on the submission side and like reading like submissions like as they come in and evaluating them and deciding on like who's going to be accepted, it's easy to tell, like, who actually wrote stories specifically for the project and who actually took the time to revise and give feedback, because you don't know going into it how much editorial work is going to be done in your story.
Yeah,
And so from being on the other side and seeing submissions come in and seeing how many submissions come in and the percentage of, like, stories that are accepted, that's given me a whole new mindset of like, there could be nearly 100 authors or more submitting to this, and they might only accept 30 to 40. So
right.
I need to make sure that I'm writing something that not only fits what they want, but also something that's polished and clean. Anthologies are not places to submit first drafts to.
Right, right. So I know that when we're submitting queries, we sometimes get revise and resubmit or even on submission. Is that something that can happen with anthologies or short stories, or is it generally just accept or reject?
I haven't personally experienced something where they told me, "Hey, I like the concept, but I think it needs a little more work and resubmit it." However, this did happen to a friend. I read one of my friend's stories, and he basically got an R&R and a short story. So, like, I never saw this before. They loved the concept, but they wanted some changes, and they literally bullet pointed the changes like you would get, like, in a book R&R. And
Interesting.
he revised it. I read it again. I'm like, "Yeah, I think you hit all the points they wanted." He resubmitted it to them, and they accepted it.
Wow.
So it did happen for him. It hasn't happened for me yet, but that's definitely a thing. I don't know how common it is, but it definitely happened.
Interesting. And then so
Yeah.
let's say you get rejected. What do you do with the rejected stories, especially if they're specifically tailored to an anthology? Do you try to revise them? Do you use them in other work? Have you ever taken a short story and used it in a longer form piece of work?
I have short stories that inspired novels that I haven't actually written the novels yet, but I have a couple of short stories that I think would be super cool to develop into full novels. And that's a cool thing about writing short stories too. Like sometimes you'll write something and be like, oh my gosh, this is a perfect concept for a novel that you wouldn't have thought of otherwise if you hadn't written the short story. And so that has happened to me. Down the road, I would love to write those. In terms of like after they're rejected, I kind of just set them aside and keep an eye out for anthology sub calls that they could fit. Like I said before, some are so specific that it could take a really long time, if ever, like, before you find something else, but I definitely have a few lying around that got passed on that I haven't placed yet. There's one that I just wrote sort of for fun that I haven't placed yet, but it's, like, a fantasy one, and there are a lot of anthologies that are, like, fantasy generic or, like, horror generic, and so if you have a fantasy story or a horror story, if
Mhm.
you come across an anthology that asks for, "Hey, we love all fantasy," or, like, "We want anything horror." Those are the kind of anthologies that I try to find because they would fit like, if it fits the genre and the other anthology doesn't have very specific things, like, elements that they're looking for, those are the places where I feel it had the best chance, and that's what happened with the one I said that got passed on and rejected. It was a horror one that I specifically wrote for an anthology that had, like, pretty specific guidelines of what they wanted,
Mm.
but I came across an anthology that was like a horror generic one, And so I submitted it to that and it got accepted.
Well,
There's
that's
always
fantastic.
ways.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
so neat. Now, so personally, I've written a few short stories, but I don't really have a big community in the short story space, just because I am more present in among novel writers and whatnot. So, how do you find people to exchange stories with? How do you build that community? Do you go to a specific social media outlet?
Twitter is where I live. And it's interesting because, like, all of my friends I swap with for short stories, we all write novels too. Like,
Oh,
I can't think of any of my friends who, like, exclusively write short stories or flash fiction. We're
hmm,
all authors who write novels too. And so it's very likely that if anyone listening wants to swap with someone who also writes short stories. Like, there are so many authors who do it, and also, like, even if you have a friend who doesn't write short stories, they could still give you feedback on your story as well. But another great way to find new authors to connect with is to look at the authors who have published in short stories. Like, I do this too, and I've connected with new authors from, like, being published with them. So, I look at, like, when I'm publishing an anthology, I'll see who's in it, and I've connected with some of those authors that I didn't know before because we were publishing the same book,
hmm,
and then we began swapping. And so if say there's a publisher who publishes anthologies that you really want to write for, and you buy one of their books and you're reading through the short stories and the anthologies, and say there's an author story in there that you absolutely love, reach out to the author on social media and say, "Hey, I read your story in this anthology, absolutely loved it. I write a similar vibe and I'm hoping to get into writing short stories. Like, would you be down to submit sometime?" And I guarantee you they'll say yes. So really looking at who's being published in the anthologies and connecting on social media is great.
amazing. That makes sense. So I think that now would be a good time to move on to how publishing or writing shorter fiction builds your career. And I know you've touched on this in terms of developing skills, in terms of adding to your resume when you're querying. Um, so would you say that writing novels and short stories are pretty much intermingled, or do you find that there's separate paths for you?
See them as similar, but they're definitely separate in the way that, like, my agent isn't going to be pitching my short stories. Like, that's something I do independently myself.
Okay.
Versus with the books, like, I want to go traditional. And so there's a whole different level of focus and direction with that.
Mm,
I find that writing and submitting the short stories gives me a constant sense of control over my writing because I'm choosing what anthologies I'm submitting to, what stories I'm writing, where I'm putting them, who I'm sharing them with. And so I have 100% control over my short stories versus the novels is not the case with that. And so in that instance, I think they're a little different. However, like I said, like, a lot of my friends do both. And so for me, like, the worlds definitely collide.
yeah.
I found that being published in anthologies has allowed me to consistently be sharing new publishing news,
Yeah.
which is something I didn't get the chance to do when I was querying the first time because I didn't submit to anthologies then. Like, because I write and submit so often, I have a whole lineup of stories waiting to come out, especially in the end of this year. And so I'm able to consistently keep people, like, just in my normal life, updated and, "Hey, look what I'm doing in publishing." I might not have my own book on a shelf yet, but I'm doing things in publishing, and in that instance, I think it's still your career either way. It's just allowing you to share things on a more consistent basis and give yourself a foundation that you are taking steps forward on your publishing journey, even if you haven't reached that big milestone yet.
That's fascinating. The fact that you mention, I hadn't even thought of, you have an agent that represents your novels, but you also have this body of writing. So I guess when you're signing with an agent, do you make sure that you retain the rights to your short stories?
It's something I never thought of, and I'm really happy you mentioned that because, like I said, the first time that I wasn't doing short stories at the time, so this wasn't even something that crossed my mind. However, now I definitely would make sure, but I feel like, I mean, short story co the only thing they would represent is if I did a short story collection.
Right.
But representing standalone stories feels like they wouldn't have any kind of claim to that, but that's a really good point, and I'm definitely going to note that on my when I get another offer question list. That's a really good one.
Yeah, see, sometimes I regret not getting an MFA, but I guess having a law degree does give me some insight. Now that you've got that piece of knowledge, what is some advice that you would give to someone that's just starting out submitting stories?
I would just say to give it a try and have fun with it. The nice thing about short stories that's completely different from a novel is it's way lower stakes. When you write a novel, you could spend a year plotting it. You can spend months drafting it. You can spend years revising and getting feedback. And then once you start querying it, you're like, literally, like, I feel like I'm on the precipice of a cliff right now because if this doesn't survive the trenches, then I'm looking back on all the time and effort I put into this story just for it to die. And that's not the case with short stories. I typically can write short stories in a day or 2. They're
Mm,
very short, like, especially short stories, you can write them very quickly,
yeah.
and the stakes are so much lower because, sure, you took time to write them, but if you submit it somewhere and it doesn't get accepted, that's totally fine. You can keep submitting just like you do when you query, but because it's such lower stakes, you don't have the pressure attached, like, "This is my whole life in my hands," like, this is my career. I can't mess this up. You can have more fun. I've literally written genres that I never imagined writing. Like, I'm straight up writing like meet cute romance flash fiction for some things. Like, I would have never done that with a novel, like with novels. But it's fun because like I see stuff, I'm like, oh, that's cool. Never did that before. With horror, like I have an obsession with writing horror short stories, which in before never thought I would like horror. Now I'm currently plotting a new thriller and I'm adding gothic horror elements to it just because I love writing horror so much.
Yeah.
And so if you allow yourself to have fun and just like try whatever and be experimental, you can discover new genres you like to write. You can, be creative and come up with new ideas you wouldn't have thought of otherwise because you're following a prompt. And the bonus is getting the acceptance, but the fun part is exploring different themes and genres and forcing yourself to write to a prompt, which is a really good skill. So I would just say to have as much fun as possible and try not to put a lot of pressure on it.
And since you mentioned prompts, that's actually so funny because I'm pretty sure that I said that I haven't really written short stories, but your comment on prompts got me thinking about how I've had so much fun writing to prompts. And I've actually been published in an anthology for a short story, so I don't know what exactly I was thinking, but all that to say that this anthology that I was published in, essentially, it was put together by an art gallery, and they have 7 paintings that they
It
put
is so
out.
cool.
Yeah, and so basically the painting is the prompt. So you're writing a short story based on a painting. And so
No way, that's so cool.
it's so neat. I love it, and I love the blending of the arts in that way, and, I mean, there are
Yeah.
lots of different organizations. I don't know if you've heard of NYC Midnight. They're super cool. So they run a ton of, contests. They have flash fiction, they have short stories, they have rhyming stories. They're really neat. But what I love about them is that they give you a prompt in terms of a genre. I think they give you an object and an emotion. So you have to work this object and emotion into a short story from a random genre. So you never know what you're going to get. And the first one I ever got when I entered was comedy. And I'm like,
I
I am not
think I've heard of
funny.
this now that you're talking more about it. I feel like I've heard of this.
Yeah, it's really cool, just all these opportunities, but it's fun. It really kind of broadens your horizons and pushes you to the edge of your comfort zone, in terms of like I don't write comedy, I write horror, I write fantasy. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really fun, and that's the thing too with, like, writing short stories, like, there's so many anthology subcultures, it's impossible to write from them all.
Yeah.
So I, like, really focus on which ones do I feel compelled to write for? Which ones pique my interest? There's one that I'm submitting for this week that the prompt was literally like they wanted it to be fantasy,
Yeah.
but connected to the language of flowers.
Oh,
So, like, it's like a flower themed anthology with fantasy. I'm like, "That's so cool." Like, okay. And it took me a while to come up with something, but it's really fun when there are these wild calls that, like, you never would think of that these publishers and editors come up with, and then it forces you to think outside the box, which is always great as a writer.
that's really true. Well, thank you so much, Demi. This has been such a
Yeah.
fantastic conversation.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
And thank you all so much for tuning in. I hope you have an absolutely wonderful new year. And this is the Pros signing off for 2025. We'll see you next Tuesday in 2026.